So thank you guys for being here tonight. I'll try to not take up too much time, but again, these are just voluntary meetings, and I'm hoping to continue doing these every few weeks, every 2 weeks, to try to help out you guys when it comes to the whole goal is to connect the information you're learning from one course to another, so that when you go from one to the next, it all makes sense. When it comes to doing diagnostics, assessments, case conceptualizations, as well as, the counseling skills that are used. Oh, and thank you, not the dean. I'm glad you're not the dean. Appreciate that. Anyways, so that's kind of the goal of why I decided to do these things, and that's why I'm offering it to multiple classes and not just one, and also recording them. So last week we talked a bit about how to use an assessment during a case conceptualization, and I gave some examples of some assessments like the Beck Depression Inventory and the Burns Anxiety Inventory, and then I also pulled up an example of an initial mental health assessment or case conceptualization. Those of you who are here will remember that. I'll be going over it again and using this as an example today again. But kind of where a lot of you guys are at in your educational process is where you're starting to learn what a case conceptualization is, how it is made, what it's made for, and then how to put it into practice. And I know that last week I mentioned that a case conceptualization, there's lots of names for it. You can also hear it called as a mental health assessment or evaluation, things like that. More in-depth ones are called psychological evaluations. Those usually include many written assessments that the client will fill out as well. But we're not going to go into that kind of depth. So again, the goal of a case conceptualization is to gather information about the client, to figure out why they're there, what is going on, and then to go on to diagnosis and then treatment plan. So we're going to start first with this gentleman that I shared with you last week, Mr. Jonathan Johansson, Esquire III. Yep, that's made up if you can't tell. So when you're doing a case conceptualization, I'm going to do a quick summary. You've got the portions of it that come from the client, you've got the portions of it that come from assessments, and then you get the portions of it that come from you, the clinician, and your observations. So this whole first section, again, this is my own template. Other universities and other sites have different templates, but this is just a general one. You have your identifying information. The chief complaint is, what the client wants, what's going on. Presenting problem. This is the big stuff. This is the stuff the client gives to you directly that you either, after that first session, remember and type out, or maybe you're jotting down notes. So if you remember this client, it was a pretty hefty one. Said that he found one of his sons dead at work on an oil rig. It was a very, very hard situation. He was working at the work site, and he was the one to find his son in just on the site dead. He tried to revive him through CPR, and it was really rough. He went into some other issues that were going on in his life at the time, and then talked about the trauma symptoms. So in this one, he's got flashbacks, avoidant behaviors, and I'll talk about those later, anxiety, sleeping, nightmares, crying, depression. He continued to have flashbacks of finding his son. That's kind of one of the big things, as well as just the anger towards the person who he feels was responsible for the negligence that happened on the job site. So that's what all of that information is. The mental status exam, I went over that last time in more depth, so if you weren't here, go ahead and watch that video. This was my observations of the client. And then biopsychosocial history, this is just about his life. Who he is, where he came from, friends, family, jobs, other kinds of things, just normal life history stuff. And then back down here into getting information about treatment history, drug and alcohol use, and all that. Okay, so right here, as you can see, this was from the DSM-4, so this dates it quite a bit. The diagnosis wouldn't change, though, if I were seeing this client today for the same reason, because the DSM-5, those symptoms still would fit. So now that I've given you that information, let's say again you have sat down with Johnny, Mr. Johnny here. He has given you all this information, and you have used, obviously if you've been to Pre-Prac 1, or if you're in counseling skills class, you've learned about using counseling skills and techniques, which are specific things we say and do to demonstrate empathy to a client as well as to gather information. So you've already done that. You've gathered the information. You thank the client. You set the next session, and they leave. And let's say you've got half hour, 45 minutes to type something up and to come up with a provisional diagnosis. A lot of times the sites you work for want a provisional diagnosis. That means your first impression, because they want to start getting the ball rolling with if there's a third-party payer, for example. There's lots of reasons for that. One is you want to get paid. Well, the only way you get paid is if insurance or something pays for it. So let's assume that's what it is. And let's say you have this data. You have all this stuff you've written down about Johnny. And then finally, let's say you've also given him some assessments. Let's say you gave him a Beck Depression Inventory. That's the one I introduced last week. And a Burns Anxiety Inventory. I also introduced that one. And just for kicks and giggles, let's say you had access to and had training to use what is called the Trauma Symptom Inventory, or the TSI. That assessment is really great when it comes to identifying if the symptoms that they're having are related to a trauma that has occurred. It's just a help. It doesn't diagnose. It just lets you know. So you have the client's data and those three tests and your own observations. So now is the time to start doing a diagnosis. We're going to call this a differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis means that there are differences between one diagnosis to another, but that there sometimes can be similarities, and so one diagnosis can look like something else. This is not uncommon, especially in, like, let's say kids. You can have children whose parents bring them in and say, oh my gosh, my son is all over the place. He's 7 years old. He's getting in trouble at school. He doesn't sit down, doesn't stay focused. He's up all night. He's overactive. And as you're listening to this, you're like, check, 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 check. This is ADHD through and through. Sounds just like it. A true differential diagnosis doesn't just look at the symptoms. It looks at everything that is present and everything that is not present. And here is why. All those symptoms, which I just said, which are about 4 of them, they are present not only in ADHD, but they're present in post-traumatic stress disorder, and it shows up that way with kids. Anxiety disorder, and that shows up as kids, as well as adjustment disorders and other disorders. So it may not be as cut and dry as we think. Thus, the differences and the similarities in the diagnoses, we have to tease them out. So the funnel technique, that's what we call this, is a way to kind of tease out the symptoms by using the diagnostic manual, which hopefully you guys all have. If you don't, you definitely will. And it's worth it. So let's move on down. Funnel as it's described. If you've never used a funnel for anything, you had a depraved childhood. That's a joke, a bad one. The funnel method is a description used to explain how abnormal behaviors, symptoms, and cognitions that cause, and this is the important part, significant impairment and distress. Symptoms must be doing that, or else they're not a diagnosis. Somebody wakes up one day and just says they're depressed. That doesn't mean they have depression. So symptoms must be present for a certain amount of time and must cause impairment and distress. And so the goal is to take a large amount of information and just funnel it down to the smallest and most accurate diagnosis. How's it done? We utilize the interview and assessment tools to narrow down a diagnosis, just like we talked about Johnny. Clinical interview. We use a biopsychosocial assessment, which I've shown you about Johnny. Mental status exam, that's what MSE is. The gathering of symptoms and cognitive problems, that you gather that during the actual assessment, talking with the client, asking questions, making observations, getting a history, finding out substance abuse issues if there are there, or medical or biological issues. And tests and measures, if you haven't taken that class yet, it's okay. You will have a chance, and also you will continue to have opportunities to use them and learn about them throughout practicum and your entire career. But some of those measures, these are all just acronyms for Beck Depression Inventory, Burns Anxiety Inventory, Milan Clinical Multi-Axial Inventory, etc., etc. Each one has a specific job to measure or to test for certain types of symptoms. So we got Johnny. We got all this stuff done. Now it's time to look at the funnel, okay? This is just another way of looking at it. So with the funnel, imagine you taking all this biopsychosocial history information. That's all this stuff that we just gathered in here. Okay, here's his history, mental status exam, as well as all the presenting problems and symptoms that he is experiencing. And we throw that in there. So there we have that. The assessment tools. We did the Beck Depression Inventory, Burns Anxiety, and Trauma Symptom Inventory. Let's say on the Beck Depression Inventory it had some symptoms come up. That he sat a lot, he did have suicidal ideation at one point, lost a lot of interest in things he enjoys. But that the number, because there's always a score, kind of says mild depression, not mild depressive symptoms. So we're not sure, but it's just there. With the anxiety symptoms, let's just say they're through the roof, and the trauma symptom inventory score is also very high. So we throw all that in there. Medical and substance abuse. He did give us a history. Medically and biologically, he's okay. He's been doing very well. In fact, I remember his words were, "I'm as healthy as a horse." Substance abuse. If you remember in the assessment from last week, he didn't have any. He said he occasionally had a beer or two once in a while. Here it was. Experimented with marijuana when he was a teenager, beer or two, but nothing more. And it's drinks beer 2 times per month on average. It's just something that was never a big deal for him. Clinical impressions. That goes back to your own ideas and your own observations. And again, we throw all this into the funnel. Now, we compare and contrast abnormal symptoms, behaviors, and cognitions to the DSM, and by the process of elimination, come to a diagnostic impression. What that means is, when we're using this book and using the process of elimination, we are not doing a mole hunt. We don't look at it and go, well, it looks like ADHD, and, and it smells like ADHD, therefore it must be ADHD. That's not what we're doing. It's not a case of it looks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, but it's probably a goose. It's different. So what we're going to do is the following. First and foremost, there are 3 possible explanations or causes for mental health disorders. First one is biological, second one is substance abuse, and the third is life. It just happens. Okay? We already know with Johnny that biologically speaking, he's okay. In fact, let's say we even asked if he's been to the doctor recently, if he's had like yearly checkups, and just for kicks and giggles to simplify this, let's say that everything was green across the board. He has no problems, no lab problems, no problems with his thyroid, no sickness, nothing that could be causing any issues. Substance use, we've already looked at that, and it's not really an issue. And finally, we have life and everything else. So ultimately, what we have just done is, by the process of elimination, we have said it is neither of these two. Now, the nice thing about the DSM is it has chapters on substance use and then medical and biological related problems. So that whole section of the book we can keep closed. Again, elimination. So review the symptoms and ask the question, which disorder clusters in the DSM might explain this person's symptoms? And write it down. So let's talk about his symptoms. Bring this up. Remember, let's talk about the depressive symptoms that he talked about. He said he's sad a lot, he's lost interest in things, and once upon a time, probably about 2 years ago, he had some suicidality, but now he currently does. Those are symptoms of depression, yes, and there could be a depressive type of disorder. And so to rule it out, the first thing we do is we have to think, maybe this is a possibility. So we get out our piece of paper and our pencil or a pen and write down depression, just like that. Easy. We go through the rest and we see all these symptoms of trauma, flashbacks, nightmares, things like that. Again, we're just like, wow, it could be trauma as well. He may have multiple diagnoses going on here. So we write down trauma or PTSD. Okay? And the next one I think would be a good idea to look at too is an anxiety disorder, because trauma disorders and anxiety disorders are separate in the DSM-5. And that's mainly because of his score on the Burns Anxiety Inventory, because it's just so through the roof. So far, we have those three. And we are good to go so far. Now what we do is narrow down the disorders that explain the symptoms. This is where it gets kind of fun, okay? Hold on a second. Whoops, my bad. So what we're going to do, and I'm going to practice this with you guys right now, that way you know what it actually looks like when you're doing it. Go to the front of the DSM, and in the front there is the index. In the index, you'll have all the disorder clusters. Just like on this page, it says major and mild neurocognitive disorders. Then over here, it's got personality disorders, other mental health disorders, substance use disorders, trauma and stress-related disorders. And so what we're going to do first is we're going to take our list here. We're going to go to the section of depressive disorders, or depression or mood disorders, and we're going to look through it. Okay? And so what we're going to see is there's major depression, and then there's other disorders under major depression. You're going to see bipolar disorder and other things that are similar to that as well. And you ask yourself the question, because you've studied this a bit and you understand, could what this client is presenting with be major depression, so major depressive disorder, persistent depressive disorder, depressive disorder due to any other medical condition, or something like that. So out of those three, what we're going to do is we're going to go, well, honestly, it doesn't sound like it could be something due to a medical condition, so we have just crossed that off the list. So again, we do everything by elimination. Major depressive disorder, maybe, but I'm not fully convinced it could be, but I'm also not fully convinced that it's not. So what I'm going to do is actually write down off to the side of depression on my paper, major depressive disorder. And then write down the page number. And I'll tell you why in a second. You do the same thing for the trauma and stress-related disorders. Go through the same process. And let's say as you're looking through those, you're like, well, there's post-traumatic stress disorder, acute stress disorder, adjustment disorders. And because you know them enough, you're like, well, it doesn't sound like an adjustment disorder or an acute stress disorder because it's been going on for so long. So it could be post-traumatic stress, PTSD. It doesn't look like some kind of dissociative disorder or anything like multiple personalities, so I'm not even going to entertain that. So I have just now gotten rid of all disorders except for 2, but I still have that anxiety disorder thing, and let's just say it sounds like you think it is generalized anxiety disorder. So now we have narrowed down to 3 possible specific disorders. This is where the fun begins. At this point, you, again, because you wrote the page number down in the book, you go over to major depressive disorder. Okay? I'm not going to actually do that for time's sake. And you pull open, there's a whole section that says major depressive disorder. This is what it looks like. This is how long it can happen with someone. These are possible medical problems they have, etc., etc. And you look through the symptoms that are on there. And again, you have all this data that you've thrown into this funnel. Biopsychosocial history, mental status, assessment tools, medical and substance abuse, and clinical impressions. And so far, you have been checking off the list things that are not there. It's not just things that are there, but things that are not. And as you're looking at major depressive disorder and you're looking through the possible symptoms that need to be present, you're like, they're not all there. This isn't a major depressive disorder. And so this is where the funnest part happens. You go to your piece of paper and go, it's not a major depressive disorder. My last 2 that I'm going to look at are post-traumatic stress disorder and generalized anxiety disorder. So you open up to trauma and stress-related disorders chapter. You go to post-traumatic stress disorder, which I just happen to open up to. It's page 271. And you start going through this. First one, exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. Oh, it says here, witnessing in person an event that occurred, or learning that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or friend. Check. Presence of one or more of the following symptoms associated with the trauma. Intrusive, distressing memories. Check. Repeated extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. So that's not really there, no. Learning, directly experiencing the traumatic event. No, not really. Okay. And so one of these just has to be present. He checks it. Presence or one or more of the following, and you just follow through. And what you'll find as you're reading through this section, and again, looking through everything you put into that funnel, that every symptom that is necessary for the disorder is present. All the way down to even the point of dissociative symptoms. Now, I said he doesn't have a dissociative disorder, but there were symptoms, and they still occur. He had some interesting things happen to him. What would happen is if he saw a car that looked like his old boss's car, and this is the guy he blamed for the accident for happening to his son, and he was driving, he would completely freak out, like almost lose control of himself and crash. He'd done it twice. Okay? So again, post-traumatic stress disorder, you read through this, you're like, okay, we know that that's there. By the process of elimination, I've gotten rid of major depression. I know for sure I'm comfortable with PTSD, but I still have generalized anxiety disorder. At that point, you go to anxiety disorder chapter. Go through the same process. The final thing you do, in each chapter there is a section that talks about differential diagnosis. It will say, if these symptoms are present, but this disorder is present, that is the disorder it should be. Or it will sometimes even say, this diagnosis can also be present with this diagnosis. And you do the same thing with each one of those 3. And what you'll find is, as you look more in depth at those chapters, that post-traumatic stress disorder best fits what this guy is experiencing. Better than major depressive disorder. He's having symptoms of depression, but if you ask yourself the question, who wouldn't? And then he's having symptoms of anxiety, but anxious symptoms are also present with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it better accounts for it in this situation. Then you already have the answer, and that is PTSD. Okay. So far, and you guys can unmute or you can write in the chat box any questions about doing a differential diagnosis using this particular method or any other method. I'm going to take that as no. Okay. So we'll now move on. So again, this is just going down to case conceptualization. I'm just giving this definition again to kind of pound it into you. It is a systematic collection and integration of clinical data. It includes everything in a mental health assessment and can be augmented by assessment tools and developmental data. Whoops. The purpose of the conceptualization is to write a snapshot of the client's functioning and to translate it into a measurable treatment plan. So I'm going to go back to something I said in the first time we met. A conceptualization is just a snapshot. It's a photograph. But as can happen to people, whoever you took a picture of at that time, they're going to grow up and get older and bigger, and they're going to change. Same thing happens with case conceptualizations. Over time, an assessment that you do with someone and how you diagnose them will likely change. Now, moving on. So you have this really great conceptualization you have written up. It has a diagnosis here. And again, just please ignore this DSM-4 thing. And it says there, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is great, but now you need to develop a treatment plan. Okay? A treatment plan includes the following. It has objectives, which, and again, I'm teaching you guys one way of doing it. You're going to have other faculty members or even supervisors who would do it a different way. This is one way, but they all pretty much play together in the same sandbox. So with a treatment plan, you have objectives, which are the long-term goals. Picture this as where the client wants to be when they're done. So with this particular guy, his original goal was to get back to the way life was before. Now, conceptually, you and I, all of you and I know that that's not possible. He's experienced a pretty significant trauma, as well as complicated grief and loss. He'll not likely be the same kind of person or be the same guy he was before. This will have changed him. However, his idea of getting back to the way he was before is he wanted to feel good enough to be able to function, to go to work, to have a relationship with his other son, with his grandchildren, and to just live his life. And that's a very broad picture, but those were kind of his words. And so the objective might say that. It might say, get to the point to where the client feels comfortable to work in a full-time job, to engage in meaningful relationships with family and friends, and to experience less symptoms so that he can have that fulfillment. Again, that's huge and it's nebulous and it's probably confusing. This is where the goals come into play. The goals are the short-term goals or steps that lead to the long-term objectives or the long-term goals. So with him, there were several things that needed to happen before he could create this bigger picture. One of them was the symptoms, the post-traumatic stress symptoms, the feeling like nothing was good enough anymore. Something needed to change. And so that's where our focus changed to what the goals needed to be, which was decrease the symptoms of trauma, for example, or decrease symptoms of feeling down and depressed, while increasing social interaction and increasing a desire to go out and get a full-time job. Because at that point, he could only work temp jobs. And then you've got types of treatments. with part of your goals is you actually say how you're going to do it. So let's say you have 3 goals. And the first goal is to decrease those symptoms of trauma. Well then, what that means is you got to use specific treatment methodologies or techniques that are made and researched to address those trauma symptoms. And so let's say you've had at least some consultation and supervision at the time, and you are being taught how to use cognitive behavioral trauma-focused therapy, or TFCBT. Yeah, TFCBT. Great. Then you put in there this goal will be met through TFCBT. 7 weeks of it, or whatever it is. I can't remember how long it usually lasts, like 7 to 12 weeks. And also frequency and duration, once a week for the next 7 to 12 weeks. Another thing I forgot to put in there is how you're going to measure progress. So let's say you decide you're going to use, give him the trauma symptom inventory again after 2 months of coming to see you, and you put that in there. And so that's essentially, very quickly, how you build a treatment plan. Now, I'm not going to go into further details about treatment plans. I'll probably do that in the next time. There's lots of different ways to build a treatment plan. Starting out, I remember somebody gave me an actual book that said, hey, here's how you do it. And it kind of felt like it was like a Cliff Notes version, but it helps so much. And so I'll probably do that for the next time we meet. But again, so today what we've gone over is differential diagnosis, taking all the information, shrinking down to the best possible explanation, and then beginning the process of treatment planning. I wasn't sure how long this is going to last today because I didn't know how many people would be here. But does anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions, please, that now is the time to ask? Even if you don't, just put something in the in the conversation so I know. I see some coming through. You're welcome. Absolutely. Absolutely glad to do this. This is very enjoyable, actually, for me. One thing is here, I'm waiting for these to come through that I just thought of. As you continue to study and you continue to learn this, you will learn if you, I'll give some thoughts on that, not the dean person. You will learn more about how disorders look similar from one to another, and which disorders can go together with others. Nobody expects you to know this right out the door, so I just wanted to establish that. Also, not the dean, nice you post this video in the first week of class. I had to go through the confusion on my own. That's why I'm doing it. These videos were not present. This is, I think, my second term to teach this class with Walden. I've taught this with other universities, and so that's why I'm like, okay, I want to create something that can be used from week to week and give students a little bit of an idea of how to do this stuff. So yeah, I appreciate the suggestion. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Also, like I said, one of the reasons I wanted to do this is so that you can take information from one class and apply it to another. Let me know if this is helping in any way like that, or if there are subjects you feel that would be helpful for me to go over that would help tie in other classes as well. Actually, I think I'm going to stop recording because I don't need all that.